The doors of courtroom 3B swung open with the heavy creak of oak, and the sound echoed through the Edward R. Royal Federal Building in Los Angeles. For most who entered, it was a place of routine files stacked, rulings signed, lives altered without fanfare. But on that day, something different pulsed in the air. A storm was gathering in human form, dressed not in robes of authority, but in a navy suit worn by a woman who had come to demand what so many before her had been denied. Her name was Jasmine Crockett. To the cameras, she was a congresswoman. To those who truly knew her story, she was a fighter who had walked 10 years in the trenches of courtrooms, where black voices were cut short, and justice was rationed like a privilege. She stood, not seated like every other attorney who knew their place. She stood tall, as if the weight of centuries pressed her upright, daring her to remain silent no more. Judge Belinda Moxley sat above her, lips pursed, gaze steady, the authority of 18 years cloaked across her shoulders. In this courtroom, Moxley was accustomed to obedience. Files shuffled, clerks hurried, voices bent into whispers. Defendants prayed in silence. But Jasmine Crockett refused the script. Her words fell like a stone striking glass. Are you seriously going to pretend that is justice? The gallery froze. People looked left and right, unsure whether to meet her gaze or bow their heads toward the bench. The bailiff shifted, one hand, brushing against his radio. For a moment, time itself stalled. What did it mean for a black woman, in a country that once counted her ancestors as 3/5 of a person, to stand here, unflinching, unbent, and accuse the bench of betrayal? You are out of line, the judge said at last, her voice thin and calculated. Jasmine's reply came low but unshaken. You are out of control. You have ignored precedent, silenced my client, and buried the truth like every other complaint that crossed your desk. In that instant, the air became suffocating, a silence so thick it felt alive. Two marshals stepped forward, ready to enforce the order, but Jasmine did not flinch. Do not touch me, she said, walking herself toward the exit. Her voice carried across the courtroom, a final cry before the cameras cut. Mark my words, this is not over. By the time she reached the steps of the building, America had already seen it. Twitter lit up with hashtags. Crockett was right. TikTok loops replayed her words like a war cry. Cable news screens split her image beside the judge's stern face. Some called her reckless. Others called her the future. But none could deny the fire that had been lit. Yet the truth was not in those 30 seconds of footage. The truth was, in the years leading to that moment, long before the marshals moved, long before the hashtags trended, Jasmine had been gathering names, files, whispers, transcripts buried in drawers. No one wanted to open. She had walked into that courtroom, knowing this might be the day it exploded. That night, she did not toast to her defiance. She sat in the quiet of her Baldwin Hills kitchen, 2 mugs of coffee gone cold, folders spread like a battlefield before her. Her pen marked page after page, connecting the hidden scars left by one judge who believed herself untouchable. A message lit up her phone. You were right to push. Call me. It is time. Jasmine's jaw tightened. This was not victory. This was war. And it was a war fought not with weapons, but with memory, with evidence, with the courage to stand when the system demanded she sit. It was the war of every ancestor who had spoken truth in chains, of every mother who had cried outside a courthouse door, of every man and woman who had seen justice slip away like smoke. This is the story of Jasmine Crockett, a woman with a suit, a voice, and a mind sharp as a blade. A woman who stood in a courtroom and refused to sit. A woman who carried the weight of silence and cracked it open for all to hear. Stay with us, because This is not just another story. It is the future our ancestors dreamed of. Hãy giúp và đồng hành, vì một tiếng nói ra màu không còn bị ngắt lời. Before the world saw her clash with Judge Belinda Moxley on live television, Jasmine Crockett was a child of the South. She grew up hearing stories of both survival and defiance. Her grandmother had been born in a segregated Texas town, where water fountains and schools were divided by race, and where dignity was a daily struggle. Her father worked long hours in modest jobs, her mother reminding her children that books were weapons stronger than fists. In the Crockett household, history was not distant. It was spoken around the dinner table, carried in the songs of the church choir, written in the wrinkles of elders who had endured. As a young girl, Jasmine learned that silence could be dangerous. Her grandmother used to say, "If you do not speak, they will write your story without you." That lesson carved itself deep into her spirit. By the time she reached university, she had already chosen law, not for prestige, but for survival hers, her family's, her people's. When she entered law school, America was still grappling with the echoes of its unfinished promises. Civil rights had been won on paper, yet black communities remained trapped in cycles of poverty, underfunded schools, and an unforgiving justice system. She read cases where men her father's age had been sentenced to decades for non-violent offenses, and she sat in classes where professors spoke of justice as if it were a neutral concept. She knew better. Justice, in her eyes, was a battlefield where black families too often lost. As a defense attorney, she walked into those battlefields every day. For 10 years, Jasmine represented clients who had little more than hope. She defended young men caught in the web of minor drug charges that carried major consequences. She stood beside mothers whose wages were garnished unfairly, beside veterans whose benefits vanished in bureaucratic smoke. She did not wear tailored suits or arrive with large legal teams. She came armed with stubborn faith that words, delivered with precision, could still cut through walls of indifference. It was during these years that she first encountered Judge Belinda Moxley. The case involved an elderly black veteran, stooped with age, but dignified in bearing, who wished to pass his modest estate to his grandchildren. Jasmine prepared meticulously service records, property deeds, every precedent she could gather. She believed the law, at least in this case, was clear. The hearing lasted less than 7 minutes. Judge Moxley dismissed it brusquely, her gavel echoing finality before Jasmine had finished her argument. The veteran's eyes clouded with defeat. Outside the courtroom, he whispered to Jasmine, "I fought for this country, but it never fought for me." Those words stayed with her long after the file was closed. At first, she told herself it was one ruling, perhaps rushed, but she began to notice patterns. The same law firm appearing again and again in Moxley's courtroom, cases dismissed with startling speed, motions denied without explanation, settlements sealed so tightly that no one could review them. Colleagues muttered in hallways, but shrugged, unwilling to speak louder. "She always rules that way," they said, as if injustice was routine. Jasmine refused resignation. She began keeping her own records, a secret archive of Moxley's rulings, dates, outcomes, the names of law firms that seemed always to benefit. She marked them on yellow pads late at night. His her apartment table covered with files no one else wanted to touch. Her suspicion grew into certainty. Moxley's courtroom was not simply careless. It was calculated. History weighed heavily on Jasmine as she pieced the puzzle together. She thought of how America's legal system had once declared her people property, then later, 3/5 of a person. She thought of the Reconstruction era, when black voices briefly entered legislatures, only to be silenced by violence and law alike. She thought of the civil rights movement, when leaders marched for justice only to be met with dogs and fire hoses. Each sealed case, each dismissed motion, felt like an echo of that same long war. Jasmine's own mentors had warned her. One elder attorney told her, "You can fight a lawyer, maybe even a prosecutor, but a judge, that is like fighting the mountain itself." She had nodded respectfully, but inside, she vowed that mountains could be shaken. Her second major clash with Moxley came in a housing fraud case. A working-class black family had been swindled by developers who manipulated paperwork, Jasmine argued passionately, presenting evidence of forged signatures and fraudulent loans. Within minutes, Moxley struck down the case. Citing procedural insufficiency, Jasmine left that courtroom burning with anger. It was not insufficiency, it was indifference, protected by a robe. Over the next few years, Jasmine collected stories quietly. A clerk whispered of transcripts altered in subtle ways. Another lawyer confided that he had stopped bringing certain cases before Moxley because it was like walking into a locked door. The wall of silence around the judge grew taller, but Jasmine's resolve sharpened. Her background gave her strength. She carried the stories of ancestors who had endured slavery and segregation, the lessons of parents who taught her resilience, and the unshakable belief that silence was complicity. She could not watch injustice and shrug. Every sealed file became a wound. Every dismissed case, a betrayal. Looking back, Jasmine often said that the first dismissal of the veteran's estate was the turning point. It was not just the speed of the ruling, but the realization that a judge's pen could erase a lifetime of service in less time than it took to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. That moment planted the seed of resistance, and from that seed grew her mission to expose what had long been hidden. Her notes grew thicker, her determination deeper. She understood that confronting a federal judge would be dangerous, but the danger only confirmed what she already knew. If no one spoke, the silence would continue forever. The night after Jasmine Crockett was removed from courtroom 3B, the headlines painted her as reckless, dramatic, even desperate. Cable news anchors debated whether she had humiliated herself or struck a blow for justice. But while the nation argued, Jasmine sat at her kitchen table in Baldwin Hills, surrounded by papers, notepads, and half-empty mugs of coffee. The noise outside did not matter. What mattered was the mountain of evidence spread before her, fragments of stories that, pieced together, revealed something darker than one unfair ruling. At 6:15 that morning, the house was quiet, but her mind was racing. Her pen scribbled names, case numbers, and the faint lines of connections only she seemed willing to trace. She wore a cotton hoodie, glasses sliding down her nose, her hair pulled back hastily. To anyone else, she looked like a woman pulling an all-nighter, but inside, she felt like a soldier preparing for a war no one else believed was real. At 7 o'clock, she picked up the phone. On the other end was an old ally, a voice she had not heard in over a year. "You really up?" the voice teased, half amused, half concerned. "I have not slept," Jasmine replied. Her tone was calm, determined. "I need everything we had on Moxley from last year, the internal memos, the sealed order from 2019, and the complaint from that housing fraud case in Flagstaff." The line was silent for a moment before the ally answered. "That file is still locked." "Then unlock it," Jasmine said firmly. "You realize what happens if this leaks before you are ready?" "Then we do not leak it," she replied. "We build it carefully." She hung up before doubt could creep in. That was the beginning. Not the viral clip, not the hashtags, but this moment, one woman alone with her files, choosing not to retreat but to dig deeper. Jasmine knew she could not win this fight with emotion alone. She needed testimony, evidence, and people willing to put their names on the line. And so began her journey, knocking on doors that had been closed, calling numbers that had long since gone silent, persuading those who had been silenced to finally speak. At 8:11 that morning, She met with Quinn Alston in a rented office space off Southwestern Avenue. Quinn had once been a court interpreter, but she had quit after a tense encounter with Judge Moxley in 2021. Her hands shook slightly as she stirred a cup of coffee, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. "You know, she threatened me, right?" Quinn said quietly, not directly, but it was there. "She told me, if you are planning to stir trouble, just remember how small the city really is." Absent. Jasmine folded her hands. "I know, and I would not ask you to speak if I did not think it mattered." Quinn sighed, her shoulders heavy with years of silence. She bent cases. Everyone knows it, but no one says a thing, because she always leaves just enough room for doubt. She is smart. She is calculated. Jasmine corrected softly. "That is different." After a long pause, Quinn reached into her bag. "I kept this. I was not supposed to, but it never sat right with me." She handed Jasmine a transcript, an unofficial record of a closed-door evidentiary hearing. The hearing had lasted less than 5 minutes, denying a woman named Celeste Renteria the chance to testify in a land seizure case. Reading the lines, Jasmine felt her heart pound. The words captured the moment Celeste was silenced. Her evidence brushed aside. The case adjourned without explanation. Quinn whispered, "That was the day I quit. That was the day I realized she is not just careless, she is dangerous." Jasmine held the transcript like a live wire. It was not enough to win a case yet, but it was proof. Proof that patterns existed, that lives had been altered in the shadows of silence. 2 days later, Jasmine sat in the back of a small cafe on Crenshaw Boulevard with a manila folder in her lap. Across from her sat Rosalind DeWitt, a former judicial assistant who had worked under Moxley for nearly 4 years. Rosalind looked nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she held her tea. She kept 2 sets of notes. Rosalind whispered, one for the court record, one for herself. She had this leather-bound planner she never let anyone touch. Sometimes it was about lawyers she disliked. Sometimes it was about the litigants, their race, their attitude, even who they came in with. She kept score. Jasmine leaned forward, careful not to react too strongly. "Why did you not speak before?" she asked. "I tried," Roseline said quickly. "I filed an internal complaint. It went nowhere. A month later, my workload doubled. I was called in for audits, and eventually I quit." Jasmine pulled out a copy of that very complaint from her folder. "I got this from a contact in Washington. It was buried, marked incomplete, but it was not incomplete." Rosalind blinked, her eyes filling with anger and relief. So they were protecting her, or themselves. Jasmine said, "No one wants to admit they ignored the warning signs. It is easier to say there were none." Rosalind exhaled, a long breath that seemed to release years of fear. "If you are going after her, you will need more than me." "I know," Jasmine replied, "but you are the second person in 48 hours who has told me the same kind of story, and I have not even knocked on all the doors yet." Later that evening, Jasmine sat in her car outside a courthouse in Riverside. She was waiting for Brady, a clerk who had promised to meet her discreetly. He slipped into the passenger seat and handed her a flash drive. "Sealed dockets from 2020 through 2023, he said quickly. 9 in total, all assigned to Moxley. Most ended without explanation. No judgments, no hearings, just sealed." Jasmine stared at the small device in her hand, feeling its weightless power. "Do you understand what this could cost you?" she asked. "I already asked to be transferred," Brady said. "If anyone finds out, he will deny it, but someone has to blow the whistle, and no one is better positioned than you." When he left, Jasmine sat alone in the silence of her car. The flash drive, glowing faintly in the dashboard light, It felt like holding a detonator. She plugged it into her laptop later that night and saw the files appear one after another. Among them was a wrongful death case involving a man named D'Angelo Price. She remembered his mother, who had once stood outside the courthouse begging the press to look deeper. The file revealed testimonies cut short, medical records ignored, and a security video listed but never entered into the record. At the bottom of the final page was the phrase that froze her blood. Case sealed by order of Judge B. Moxley. For Jasmine, the journey had begun. She was no longer a congresswoman who had gone viral for defying a judge. She was a woman carrying transcripts, flash drives, and stories that had been buried. The storm ahead would be fierce. But now she had more than suspicion. She had proof. By Thursday morning, the complaint was no longer a secret tucked into a filing office in San Francisco. It was everywhere. Whispered in law schools, dissected on legal blogs, splashed across breaking news tickers, 86 pages, signed and sealed, naming Judge Belinda Moxley as a violator of ethical standards, a manipulator of justice, and a woman who had left a trail of broken lives behind her. Most politicians would have stood before cameras, relishing the spotlight. But Jasmine did not call a press conference. She did not flood Twitter with fiery posts. Instead, she walked quietly into a small studio in Culver City. A podcast called Justice Over Coffee. 2 young law graduates hosted it, working with borrowed equipment and a loyal but modest audience. Why us? One of them asked, surprised. You asked the right question. Jasmine said calmly, not what happened, but why it kept happening. The microphones hummed, and Jasmine spoke. Without script or slogan, she told stories of cases buried, families silenced, evidence ignored. She did not just make mistakes. Jasmine said, her voice low and steady. She made choices that hurt people who had no power to fight back. And when they tried, she silenced them. Until now, that episode dropped quietly on Thursday night. By Friday morning, it had been shared tens of thousands of times. Law students transcribed it. Activists clipped it into reels. Within hours, it was no longer just a podcast, it was testimony broadcast to a nation that was suddenly listening. The federal judiciary released a statement acknowledging receipt of the complaint and confirming a preliminary review. Belinda Moxley's response came swiftly. A brief press release, dismissing the allegations as baseless and politically motivated. She did not deny sealing the cases. She did not deny refusing recusal in conflicts of interest. She did not deny the complaints that had disappeared from her record. She simply blamed politics. By Friday afternoon, the storm had spread into Congress itself. Jasmine's phone rang. On the other end was Congressman Lowell Brenner, chair of the House Judiciary Oversight Subcommittee. We saw the filing, he said cautiously. It's going to get noisy. I'm ready. Jasmine answered, you sure? Once this passes preliminary review, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. I'm not here for bottles or genies, she replied. I'm here because she should never have been on that bench this long. That night, CNN replayed the clip of Jasmine being removed from courtroom 3B, but this time, the footage ran alongside headlines. Crockett files bombshell complaint against federal judge. Silence breaks in case against Moxley. The image of a black congresswoman refusing to sit down carried a weight history could not ignore. The backlash came just as swiftly. Within days, 3 opinion pieces appeared in California newspapers, defending Moxley's reputation. Anonymous legal sources suggested Jasmine was grandstanding for political points. A former colleague of Moxley's appeared on air, claiming Jasmine was weaponizing identity politics. Online, the harassment grew vicious. Celeste Renteria's small business page was bombarded with fake negative reviews. Roslyn Dewitt received anonymous emails calling her a liar. Even Brady, the clerk, who had risked his career, found his car tires slashed outside his apartment. Jasmine responded with one short post. Silencing people is how this mess started. Don't expect us to go quiet now. No hashtags. No theatrics. Just defiance written in plain words. Behind the noise, something deeper was happening. The wrongful death case of D'Angelo Price was reopened under emergency review. A new judge acknowledged serious irregularities in the original proceedings. An internal memo from 2021 surfaced, showing that Moxley had been warned by a colleague about her dismissive treatment of lower-income litigants. And then, the turning point. Celeste Renteria agreed to testify publicly. The hearing room was crowded when she walked in. She wore a plain blouse, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. Her voice cracked at first, then steadied as she recounted how her family's land had been seized, how she was silenced mid-sentence, and how Moxley had looked her in the eye and said, "Some people don't know when they're out of their depth." The room froze. Even the panelists stopped writing. By evening, every major news outlet was running the clip. This was no longer about one complaint. It was about the sound of silence breaking across the country. Phones began to ring. The Judicial Accountability Initiative, a quiet organization Jasmine had partnered with, launched a hotline. Within 48 hours, over 300 calls poured in from court employees, litigants, even lawyers. Some told stories eerily similar to Moxley's courtroom. Others spoke of different judges, different names, but the same pattern: sealed files, silenced voices, unaccountable power. One television anchor summed it up during a legal roundtable: "She has made a lot of people uncomfortable, but maybe that's exactly what this country needed." In Washington, Moxley's allies scrambled. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Pressure mounted on committees to delay or dismiss the review. But outside those walls, the tide was shifting. What began as one woman refusing to sit down was now a movement. Ordinary people were asking, how many more Moxleys are out there? On Monday morning, Judge Belinda Moxley did not appear in her courtroom. Her docket was reassigned without explanation. The doors were locked. Federal investigators arrived at the courthouse by noon. No statements were given, but the silence spoke volumes. That evening, Jasmine sat on her balcony as the sun dipped behind the Los Angeles skyline. She did not smile. She did not post. She simply breathed the deep breath of someone who knows the storm has only begun. The first strike came quietly. An article appeared in a respected California paper, written by an anonymous judicial insider, calling Jasmine Crockett a reckless political opportunist. It accused her of fabricating evidence, of manipulating grieving families, of turning the courtroom into theater. By the following morning, the article had been echoed on 3 national networks. The framing was clear. If they could not disprove her case, they would discredit the woman behind it. But the assault did not stop at her reputation. Rosalind DeWitt, the former judicial assistant who had come forward, found her personal emails leaked online. Private photos were shared on message boards, cruel captions mocking her appearance, her past relationships. Celeste Renteria's small business was bombarded with fake 1-star reviews until Google froze the page. Quinn Alston, the interpreter, received a letter slipped under her apartment door. Troublemakers do not last long in this city. Brady, the clerk who had risked everything to hand Jasmine the flash drive, came home to find his apartment door ajar. Nothing had been stolen, but the message was clear. They knew where he lived, and they could enter without knocking. Jasmine knew these tactics well. She had studied history, had read the accounts of whistleblowers. Silenced, not by bullets, but by fear. It was the same formula. Smear, intimidate, isolate, make the witnesses doubt themselves, make the public doubt their hero. It was not just about Judge Moxley anymore. It was about sending a warning to anyone who might dare follow Jasmine's path. One evening, As Jasmine left her office in Pomona, a black SUV trailed her for 6 blocks. When she pulled over to test whether it was coincidence, the vehicle idled behind her, headlights glaring. Only when she dialed a number on her phone did it speed away. She did not speak of it to her staff. She did not want to frighten them, but she wrote it down in her notes. Surveillance confirmed. They are watching. On the surface, the media storm grew louder. A primetime anchor asked bluntly, "Is Jasmine Crockett waging a personal vendetta against a respected judge?" The chyron beneath her face read, "Congresswoman" or "Crusader." Old clips from her political campaigns were dredged up, twisted into signs of ambition. Her 10 years as a defense attorney were reframed as training in manipulation. It was a full-scale character assassination, carried out with surgical precision. But while some viewers nodded along, others saw through the script. Letters began arriving at her congressional office. Handwritten notes from widows, from veterans, from teachers. "Do not stop. Keep fighting. You are speaking for those of us who never had a chance." One letter from a retired postal worker in Detroit read simply, "I sat in a courtroom like that once." You are right. They do not listen. Make them listen. For Jasmine, those letters mattered more than the headlines. They reminded her why she had chosen this war. Not for herself, but for the nameless faces who had long accepted silence as their sentence. Still, the pressure was relentless. In Washington, whispers spread that she had jeopardized her standing within the Democratic caucus. A senior colleague pulled her aside. "Jasmine, you are talented. You could go far. But if you keep poking this hornet's nest, you will be finished before you begin." She looked him in the eye and replied, "Then I would rather be finished with my integrity than successful with my silence." Her words circulated, quoted on activist pages, painted on protest signs. In Los Angeles, a small march formed outside the Edward R. Royal Federal Building. Dozens of people carried placards. Crockett was right. Judges are not untouchable. It was not a massive crowd, but it was proof that fear had begun to crack. Moxley's defenders grew more aggressive. An op-ed accused Jasmine of undermining the independence of the judiciary. A former prosecutor suggested on air that Crockett's complaint could set a dangerous precedent for political interference. Yet every attack only amplified the question the public could no longer ignore. If she is wrong, why are so many voices risking everything to stand with her? The threats against witnesses escalated. One evening, Celeste found graffiti sprayed across her office door. Liar. Rosalind received a call from an untraceable number, a man whispering, "We know where your daughter goes to school." Jasmine met with them, her voice calm but resolute. "They want you afraid. Because your truth is powerful. That means you matter more than they want to admit." To protect them, Jasmine coordinated with the Judicial Accountability Initiative to provide safe channels of communication, secure housing for the most vulnerable, and pro bono legal counsel. She knew she could not shield everyone, but she could make sure no one stood alone. The more she resisted, the more her enemies doubled their efforts. One morning, a news outlet published a headline, "Crockett misused campaign funds for personal vendetta." The story was based on a leaked document that, upon inspection, was forged, but by the time it was disproven, the smear had already spread. Jasmine read it over her coffee, sighed, and wrote in her notebook, "False flag number 1. Expect more." And then came the chilling moment. Late at night, as she reviewed files, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "If you do not walk away, next time, it will not be your reputation at stake." She stared at the screen, heart pounding, then set the phone down. Fear brushed against her, but it did not take root. Instead, she whispered to herself, "If they think they can silence me with threats, they have not been paying attention." That same week, a quiet but powerful shift occurred. 3 new litigants came forward. people Jasmine had never met, whose cases had also been dismissed by Moxley. One was a retired school teacher from Modesto, another a small business owner from Fresno, the third a man whose brother had died in pretrial custody. Their willingness to join the complaint showed something crucial. Intimidation was failing. Instead of shrinking the movement, the threats were feeding it. For Jasmine, the message was clear. She was no longer carrying this burden alone. Each new voice was a shield, each affidavit a weapon against silence. And if the powers that be wanted to make her an example, then she would let them not of failure, but of defiance. By the second week of the review, Jasmine Crockett was no longer a lone voice in the storm. What had begun as one woman against a judge was now swelling into a chorus, a movement, a cause, too visible to dismiss. But Jasmine knew momentum alone was not enough. To crack the wall that had protected Judge Moxley for 18 years, she would need more than outrage. She would need alliances. The first came quietly. Civil rights organizations that had once kept a careful distance reached out through private calls. One veteran activist told her, "You've turned whispers into headlines. We cannot let you carry this alone." Soon, the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, the American Civil Liberties Union, and smaller grassroots groups in California began coordinating with her office. Each had their own history of battling systemic injustice, but now they converged on a single target: accountability in the judiciary. Next came the lawyers. Dozens of young attorneys, many of them Black and Latino, offered their time to sift through old rulings. Searching for patterns, they worked unpaid, often late into the night, driven not by ambition, but by the knowledge that they were building something historic. One night, a young woman named Althea dropped a box of files on Jasmine's desk. "I found 3 probate cases, same law firm, same judge, same outcome," she said breathlessly. Jasmine glanced through the papers, recognizing the stamp of silence that had become Moxley's signature. "Good work," she murmured. "You just helped us draw the line straighter." But alliances came with risks. Every new voice meant a new target for retaliation. Jasmine reminded her team, "They will come for us harder now. Be ready." And she was right. Opposition media doubled its assault, labeling the coalition a radical crusade threatening the independence of the judiciary. Yet for every insult, another ally stepped forward. A retired federal judge gave a televised interview stating calmly, "No bench is above scrutiny. If these allegations hold, accountability is not politics, it is justice." The true turning point, however, arrived unexpectedly. One afternoon, Brady, the clerk who had risked his career by giving Jasmine the flash drive, showed up at her office pale and shaken. He placed a single manila envelope on her desk. "This came to me through a colleague," he whispered. Inside was a photocopy of a letter written 5 years earlier from a whistleblower within Moxley's own chambers. The letter described deliberate case manipulation, instructions given orally to staff, and a chilling line at the end: "If this ever comes to light, it will shake not only this courthouse, but the public's faith in the judiciary as a whole." The whistleblower had signed with initials, only J.R., but the handwriting was neat, meticulous, unmistakably authentic. For Jasmine, it was the missing piece, proof not only of misconduct, but of awareness inside Moxley's circle. The revelation detonated like a bomb. Within 48 hours, major outlets from New York to Atlanta picked it up. What had been a California story was now national news. Cable panels debated not whether Jasmine was right, but how deep the rot went. Editorials demanded a wider investigation. The question shifted from, "Is Judge Moxley guilty?" to, "How many judges are hiding behind silence?" As pressure mounted, Jasmine convened a meeting in Los Angeles. Around the table sat civil rights leaders, pro bono lawyers, community organizers, and even a few sympathetic politicians. The air was thick with urgency. We cannot let this stay a single judge case. One activist argued, "This is systemic." Jasmine listened, hands folded, then spoke firmly. "Belinda Moxley is the spark, but the fire has always been bigger. We start with her, then we keep going." In the days that followed, Jasmine's network expanded further. University law clinics offered research support. Former litigants who had long given up hope began sending affidavits. Even clergy joined the cause, preaching sermons about truth and justice that drew standing ovations. One pastor declared from the pulpit, "Crockett is not just fighting for herself. She is fighting for every widow, every worker, every voice ever ignored in a courtroom." The Federal Review Panel, once expected to move slowly, now found itself under the glare of national attention. Reporters camped outside their offices. Senators began issuing statements, some cautious, some bold. One conservative voice warned of dangerous overreach, but another, more surprising, said bluntly, "If the allegations are true, impeachment must be considered." It was the first time the word had been spoken aloud on the Senate floor. Through it all, Jasmine remained measured. She granted only selective interviews, preferring community forums to cable networks. Her strategy was clear: speak where people listened with open hearts, not where narratives were manufactured. In a town hall in Baldwin Hills, she told a crowd of 200, "They will say, this is about politics. It is not. It is about power unchecked, power that has crushed too many lives. We cannot fix every wound overnight, but we can refuse to let them deepen." The applause that followed was thunderous. For many in the audience, elderly black women, young organizers, middle-aged fathers, Jasmine was more than a congresswoman. She was a vessel for their own unspoken stories, the pain they had carried without redress. As the week closed, the atmosphere shifted from defense to anticipation. Everyone knew the storm was about to escalate. Moxley herself had gone silent. Her chamber shuddered, her allies speaking louder on her behalf than she did for herself. Whispers of a resignation began circulating, though no official word emerged. And yet, Jasmine was unmoved. One evening, as she walked out of her office, flanked by 2 volunteers, a reporter called after her, "Congresswoman, what happens if this reaches impeachment?" Jasmine stopped, turned, and looked directly at the cameras. Then, "It will not be just about one woman on one bench. It will be about the people this system has failed for decades. And we will keep going, because justice does not end with one victory. It begins with it." The hearing room was packed long before sunrise. Reporters queued outside the Clara Shortridge Foltz Criminal Justice Center, their cameras waiting like watchful hawks. Inside, the benches overflowed with lawyers, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who had traveled from across the state. Some clutched handmade signs, others clutched hope. For weeks, the whispers had built. This would be the day truth met its sharpest test. At 9 o'clock sharp, the panel of federal judicial reviewers filed in. They were stern, gray-suited, unflinching. Every eye in the chamber turned toward the empty seat, reserved for Judge Belinda Moxley, and then she entered shoulders squared, chin lifted, her robe replaced by a tailored suit. For nearly 2 decades, she had commanded courtrooms with the authority of untouchable power. But today, she was the one on trial. The first testimony came from Celeste Renteria. She stepped to the microphone, trembling hands clutching her prepared statement. Yet when she began to speak, her voice carried with the weight of generations. She recounted how her family's land, passed down from her grandmother, had been stripped through a ruling, Moxley forced through without hearing her evidence. She looked me in the eye. Celeste said, pausing to steady her breath, and told me some people don't know when they are out of their depth. She was not just dismissing my case. She was dismissing who I was. The room fell into silence. Even the panelists stopped scribbling notes. Across America, millions watched live as Celeste's words echoed through television speakers, radios, and phones. For those who had never known her, she became a symbol, a face for every unheard story. Then came Rosalind Dewitt, the former judicial assistant. She described the secret planner Moxley kept, filled with personal remarks about litigants, their race, their demeanor, even who sat beside them in court. She kept score, Rosalind whispered, and the score was never in favor of people who looked like me. Gasps rippled through the chamber. For the first time, the public saw a portrait of bias, not hidden in legal jargon but etched in daily behavior. Quinn Alston followed, steady but cautious. She told of the veiled threat Moxley had whispered to her. Remember how small this city really is. Quinn looked directly at the panel as she added, I quit that day because I realized this was not justice. It was control. Finally, Brady's sealed files were presented, dozens of dockets, closed without hearings, vanished from public view, with nothing but Moxley's signature, and then the letter surfaced the whistleblower's warning from inside Moxley's chambers, predicting exactly what was now unfolding. The evidence was overwhelming, but the day's most dramatic moment had yet to come. For the first time since the scandal broke, Judge Belinda Moxley herself rose to speak. She adjusted the microphone, her voice sharp, controlled. These accusations are baseless, she declared. They are politically motivated attacks orchestrated by an ambitious congresswoman who has weaponized personal grievances. Her words landed like cold steel. But as she continued, her mask began to slip. When asked why she had sealed so many cases, she bristled. I do not owe explanations to people who do not understand the law. When pressed on the derogatory notes in her planner, she smirked. Every judge makes observations. Mine were private, until someone betrayed my trust. The arrogance that had shielded her for years now betrayed her in public. The panel exchanged glances. Viewers at home saw not a victim of politics, but a woman intoxicated by unchecked power. By the time she finished, the chamber buzzed not with sympathy but with anger. Outside, the crowd roared. Chants of accountability now rose above the traffic. Journalists ran breathless updates. Moxley doubles down. Panel visibly disturbed by judge's defense. Jasmine Crockett, seated quietly near the back, did not smile. She had not come for theater. She had come for truth, and she knew that today's spectacle was bigger than one judge's downfall. It was about forcing a system to look itself in the mirror. By evening, the review panel issued an unprecedented statement. Judge Belinda Moxley was suspended pending investigation. A special inquiry team would examine not just her cases, but the oversight mechanisms that had allowed them to vanish. For the first time in memory, the fortress of judicial immunity had been cracked open. The announcement sent shockwaves across the nation. Cable hosts who once doubted Jasmine now spoke her name with respect. Editorials hailed the moment as a turning point for judicial accountability. And in black communities across America, elders nodded. Knowingly, justice had not arrived, but at least the silence had been broken. That night, Jasmine returned home to Baldwin Hills. Her phone buzzed endlessly with calls from reporters, allies, even senators. She set it aside. Instead, she stepped onto her balcony, watching the Los Angeles skyline burn orange. With the setting sun, she thought of Celeste's trembling hands, Rosalind's whispered truth, Brady's quiet courage. She thought of every life bent or broken under the weight of silence. And then she thought of the road ahead. Suspension was not removal. An investigation was not justice. The fight was far from over. She whispered to herself, "This is not the end. This is only the beginning." Cliffhanger. The system had been shaken, but not yet remade. And Jasmine knew that to finish this battle, she would have to face forces even greater than Moxley herself. When the announcement came that Judge Belinda Moxley was officially suspended pending full investigation, the city did not erupt in cheers. There were no fireworks, no victory parades. Instead, there was a quiet murmur, a shifting of air, as if people realized the ground beneath them could indeed move. For Jasmine Crockett, there was no celebration either. She had not fought to humiliate a woman in robes, nor to score headlines that would fade with tomorrow's cycle. She had fought because too many voices had been silenced for too long. And even now, with Moxley removed from her bench, Jasmine knew the silence was far from broken. She walked once more through the courthouse steps in downtown Los Angeles. The building looked the same as it always had: towering columns, polished floors, echoes of authority in every corner. But Jasmine felt something different now. It was not triumph. It was weight. The weight of knowing this was only one crack in a wall, built high and wide, a wall that had stood against truth for generations. She thought of Celeste Renteria, finally able to walk into a courtroom with her head lifted. No longer invisible, she thought of Rosalind Dewitt, who carried the scars of intimidation but refused to stay quiet. She thought of Brady, the clerk who risked his livelihood to slip her the flash drive. And she thought of the countless others whose names would never trend on social media, but whose lives had been quietly altered by decisions signed and sealed in silence. This was not a story of a hero toppling a villain. It was a story of what happens when people decide they will no longer be erased. Jasmine had been the voice on the microphone. Yes, but it was the chorus behind her that made the system tremble. The nation, too, felt that tremor. Calls flooded into judicial hotlines. Other whistleblowers began to emerge, telling stories from states as far as Georgia, Illinois, and Texas. For the first time in decades, people were daring to ask, who judges the judges? And that question, once unthinkable, now echoed in congressional hearings, law school classrooms, and church basements alike. Jasmine did not seek the spotlight that followed. She declined primetime interviews and glossy magazine covers. Instead, she returned to Baldwin Hills, to the same modest kitchen table where the fight had begun. Stacks of folders still crowded the wood, but beside them now sat fresh letters from strangers, thank you notes, affidavits, and cries for help. Each one reminded her why she had started. In one letter, a grandmother from Oakland wrote, "My grandson lost his case before it even began. The judge never let his lawyer finish. For years, I thought we were alone. Thank you for proving we are not." Jasmine read it slowly, her eyes stinging, and whispered back, though the woman could not hear, "You were never alone." History would one day write this chapter as the downfall of Judge Moxley, but Jasmine hoped it would be remembered as something larger. The moment ordinary people realized they had the right to demand better, that courage did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered in back rooms. Sometimes it trembled at microphones. Sometimes it stood tall in navy suits and refused to sit down. But always, it carried forward. As she prepared to face the next battles for reform, for oversight, for the countless names still waiting for justice, Jasmine carried with her a single lesson. Power protects itself until silence is broken, and once broken, it can never be whole again. So, she left the courthouse that evening, not as a victor, but as a reminder that one voice can ripple into thousands, that one refusal to sit down can stand entire systems on edge, and that justice, fragile as it may be, is never given. It is demanded. Final note to audience. If you are watching this and think your voice is too small, remember Jasmine's stand. They may remove you from the room. They may mock you, threaten you, or try to bury your truth. But they cannot erase it. The cracks are already showing, and through them, one day, the light will break.